The disaster is coming closer and closer. You are in a state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system.
As South Africa confronts Angola over the future of Namibia.
What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems.
A bush conflict where guerrilla skirmishes are developing fast into open warfare.
For more than 20 years, from 1966 to 1989, South Africa fought a war that was rarely officially acknowledged, often deliberately obscured and deeply misunderstood by the people whose lives it shaped. A conflict that stretched far beyond borders and battlefields into ideology, global politics, and national identity. This conflict became known as the South African Bush War, sometimes called the South African Border War, and sometimes simply referred to as the War in Angola. Good day, everyone. My name is Henry. It is good to meet you all again. Today is going to be a very interesting video, I think, because I am covering a part of history that South Africa really does try to suppress or doesn't speak about enough, especially in high school and growing up. And yeah, this is just covering the South African border war or Bush war or Angolan war, however you want to refer to it as. Yeah, hopefully we try to cover this extensively. I will be having 3 parts to this series, and this is the first part, and I hope you really do enjoy. So grab a snack, grab a hot drink, and wind down. At the center of this conflict was a territory called Southwest Africa, which is now known as Namibia. And this is a clear distinction between countries, all right? It wouldn't be accurate for us to call it a country or to call it we can call it a piece of land, but to say country is a bit of a push, because the reason we use the word territory was because back then it was more about colonial rules and colonial spaces and land and which countries occupied which, and this is why they were known as territories, right? And this was originally colonized by Germany and later placed under South African administration after World War I in 1919. Now, instead of preparing for Southwest Africa for independence, South Africa ruled it as a de facto extension of itself, imposing apartheid laws, segregating populations according to the skin color, and exploiting resources, all the while ignoring repeated calls from the United Nations to relinquish control in what is known as one of the darkest periods in South African history. And this is referring to apartheid, one of the darkest periods to be a South African. For many Namibians, this rule was not an administration, but an occupation, and resistance began to grow steadily throughout the mid-20th century. Out of this resistance emerged SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, led by Dimo Hamambo. SWAPO was a nationalist liberation movement that formed in 1960 to end South African rule and achieve Namibian independence. SWAPO initially pursued political and diplomatic strategies, but after peaceful efforts failed and repression intensified, the organization began to militarize. Its armed wing became known as PLAN, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, which adopted guerrilla war tactics, launching small-scale attacks against South African military and administrative targets. The first major armed clash occurred on the 26th of August 1966 at Ovomboland in Namibia, when planned fighters were attacked by South African forces, marking the beginning of a full-scale conflict. And from that moment onward, South Africa was engaged in a long counter-insurgence war. To the apartheid government, SWAPO is not presented as a nationalist liberation movement, but as a communist threat, allegedly controlled by the foreign powers and part of a broader plan to destabilize Southern Africa. This framing by the South African government was planned and intentional. Now, this is because during the World War, the global politics were divided between the capitalist, the West Bloc, led by the United States, and the communist Eastern Bloc, which was led by the Soviet Union. And South Africa positioned itself as an anti-communist ally in the region. Right? And by doing this, the apartheid state justified military expansion while gaining indirect support, or better put, tolerance, from the Western governments that feared Soviet influence spreading across Africa. And that's just really a very narrowed down explanation of that. It's just explaining that the South African government was very anti-communist. It really didn't like the ideas of the Soviets. And so it used this narrative because at the time, right, it was more about power against power, right, the East against the West. And the biggest proponent of this was the communist ideology, right? And the people in the US, the powers in the US, were really afraid of having this narrative being spread. As we can see, there's a saying that goes, communism is only good on paper. And hopefully, once again, I do a deep dive on that topic. But the South African government really feared that. And should I say rightfully so? I think I will say rightfully so. But the organization itself wasn't what was to be feared. It was just the ideology, and we will see how the South African government handled things. The most important of these was the MPLA, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, led by Agostinho Neto and later preceded by José dos Santos. MPLA was a Marxist-aligned party supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba, which ultimately took control of the Angolan government. Now we can see the resurgence or the reoccurrence of this theme about communism and the idea of it spreading, and the fears of the South African government literally coming to life. And so they use this as a leverage, or as some form of leverage or platform to justify the wars and the violence that they were about to inflict on the nation. Opposing the MPLA was UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, founded and led by Johannes Savimbi. UNITA was an anti-communist movement backed by South Africa and at times the United States, as well as the FNLA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, which played a smaller role as the war progressed. When MPLA took over, it allowed SWAPO fighters to operate from Angolan territory, fundamentally changing the scale of the border war. In late 1975, South Africa launched Operation Savannah, led by Constant Viljoen, an SANDF commander, a covert military operation in which South African troops crossed deep into Angola in support of UNITA forces, despite publicly denying their involvement. Although militarily effective, international pressure forced South Africa to withdraw, but despite the backlash, the message was very clear. The war would no longer be confined to Namibia, and with that, it marked the beginning of the South African Bush War.